Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you tonight. We appreciate so much your diligence to be here on Wednesday night as we gather for Bible study. It's such an encouragement to be able to be together and to study from God's Word and draw strength from it and from one another. And we appreciate you being here to be a part of it. We're studying, and this is the last lesson in our current study guide. We're studying Old Testament characters, but this study to me has been rewarding, and so I decided we'd just dive in a little deeper and do another set of Bible characters from the Old Testament. And so a new study guide is on the table in the back if you care to get one, and we'll move right on into it next week, Lord willing. Someone asked me, and I think it's worth commenting on, that we use the expression Old Testament characters. Sometimes we talk about New Testament characters. And someone asked if we could be implying, when we call them characters, that these are not real people, that they are maybe characters in a play or characters in a novel or something like that. And so I certainly hope it's clear that we understand and we believe that these are real people, that the individuals that we're studying are actual, real, historical people, and the events recorded in their lives actually happened. So the word character could mean a make-believe person. Actually, an alternate meaning of the word character just means a person. And so that's what we're talking about. We'll talk about real persons here. And I want to make sure that's understood. We wouldn't want to leave anybody with the impression that these are less than true historical beings. All right, so tonight, one of the great individuals whose story is told in the Old Testament, Daniel. And so we'll start our reading in Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with a part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he would bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. All right, so here's how Daniel ended up in Babylon. I've always thought it's kind of interesting that the Babylonians, obviously what typically happened, not just by the Babylonians, but other conquering empires, is when you conquer a people, you move them out. And maybe you transplant other people in where they were, but you move them out of their homeland and you scatter them throughout your empire. There are probably several reasons for that. Principal among them might be you don't want them to foment a revolution. They're all still right there, and they're all still together, and they get their heads together and their energies together, and they might very well decide to fight back again. And we don't want that. We're going to scatter them. We'll take them out of their homeland. We'll scatter them. That was sort of typical operating procedure, and the Babylonians certainly followed it. But I thought it was interesting that Nebuchadnezzar's plan was not just to scatter them, but to actually incorporate them into his empire by taking select individuals and bringing them to Babylon to train them and to educate them in the language and ways of the Chaldeans. And so I thought this was kind of an interesting part of Nebuchadnezzar's plan to integrate certain individuals into his empire. Daniel was among those who was chosen in that way. Obviously, they're looking for exceptional people. Verse 4 is they are called children, in whom is no blemish, well favored. But notice, these children would be skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's. So these weren't little children. These were what would we guess? I mean, they're adolescents, teenagers probably. They were old enough to have demonstrated that they were top notch. They probably had good intellect They had reasonable skills already. So they were chosen on that basis. And Daniel, and of course we also know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among those who were chosen and brought to Babylon for these purposes. I think what we, maybe in our mind, when we imagine the nation of Judah being taken by the Babylonians, we think of maybe harsh oppression. And there were a lot of oppressive things that happened, no doubt, especially in the siege of Jerusalem and the taking of the nation. But at least some individuals, when they got to Babylon, were treated reasonable and were given opportunity, and Daniel would be among those. Now, as soon as Daniel gets there, there's an issue. Verse 5, the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Of course, those, I never understood this. Why do we typically remember Daniel by his Hebrew name, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by their Chaldean name? I don't know why we do that. But these are their Hebrew names, obviously. He said, verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So, there's a problem. Daniel understood that he would be defiling himself with the king's meat and the wine which he drank. Why would that be so? So why would it be that if Daniel participated in other words, the king is setting aside some probably choice provisions. I mean, you don't imagine that he's giving them off-cast food. He's probably given them some very excellent provisions. Daniel sees it as a thing that would defile him. Wade?
So in Hebrew law, as far as I know, there's no plants that were off limits. All plants they could eat. But with meat, there was meat that they had to avoid and meat that they could eat. And so I'm assuming that Daniel decided that I'm not even going to have to try to figure out which ones were which. I know that I can eat all the plants, so I think that's the reason he asked for just plants, plant food.
Okay. So under the law of Moses, and I think you're exactly right here, it's clear that Daniel was determined to live by the law he'd brought up under. And again, this would argue to his age. He's old enough to know and to be committed to keeping the law of God under the Old Testament system. And as Wade pointed out, there were kinds of meats that were unclean under that system. And so in order for an animal, for instance, this is oversimplification, I'm sure, but in order for an animal to be clean and the meat therefore could be eaten, the animal had to have a cloven hoof and had to chew the cud. And so a pig has a cloven hoof, but a pig doesn't chew the cud. You can't eat pig. A cow, on the other hand, has a cloven hoof, and he chews the cud. You can eat a cow. And so there were those kind of determinations. There were kinds of fish that you could eat and you couldn't eat. And Daniel obviously was aware of all those stipulations and was determined not to do it. Someone has also suggested, and I'm not sure whether this is provable or not, I don't know any place in the Old Testament that actually addresses the idea of eating meats that had been offered to idolatrous gods. Now we know in the New Testament that became a huge issue in the early church. Someone that I was reading after suggested that could have been a potential problem here, and I don't know. It doesn't say so, and we know for sure that Daniel would have been committed to clean and unclean meats according to the law. Whether the idea of eating meats offered to idols was a contentious thing in his mind, I don't know. And I don't know that I've read any place in the Old Testament where that specifically is addressed. We know it is in the New Testament. But for whatever reason, Daniel was sure Oh, by the way, I did have one reference. Look at Deuteronomy 32:38. Maybe I just misspoke because I see my note 32, Deuteronomy 32:38. It says, which did eat the fat of their sacrifices, drank the wine of their drink offerings, let them rise up and help you and be your protection. Verse 30 says, he shall say, where are their gods, their rock in whom they trusted, which did eat the fat of their sacrifices? So there's a reference that maybe there was some concern about meats offered to idols. Okay, so Daniel says, I really don't want to do that. Can you do something for us? He speaks to the chief of the eunuchs. Verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melsar, the prince of the eunuchs, the prince of the eunuchs had said over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenances of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which eat the portion of the king's meat. Then Melsar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. All right. So notice verse 9 starts out that God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. You got to believe that if that relationship didn't exist, that when Daniel made this request, the prince of the eunuchs would say, absolutely not. There's no way. I'm not. You asked me to put my neck on the chopping block, because if you guys don't eat the meat and you start looking poorly, then the king's going to come after me, wanting to know why I haven't done my job, and I'm not going to endanger my position or my life even by doing that. That I think would have been the typical reaction, but it spells out to us that Daniel had already developed a relationship with this fella, wherein the prince of the eunuchs was willing to grant him a 10-day test. And as Wade said, this pulse is some kind of a plant or grain-based food, not animal-based. And here's my question to you. So we got two guys, and we're going to feed one of them choice steaks and all the trimmings. And we got another guy over here, we're going to serve him cereal. How would that, I'm just asking, how would that, you think, typically turn out? Anybody willing to take a speculation on that, Monty?
I know when our kids was young, where we lived over the other side of Hickman County, our neighbors down the road were vegetarians. And their children, I remember the little girl, I think, if I remember correctly, her hair got to falling out. And they had to give up on that because the proteins they was getting from plants wasn't sufficient. And they had to start eating some meat.
Looked kind of wormy.
Yeah. So typically it seems people that subsist entirely on a vegetable diet, they're not fat and happy looking like I am. They tend to be thin.
Yeah, that's my thinking too. The fact that they did look better than those who'd been eating a high-fat, high-protein diet, and they'd been just eating pulse, grain, vegetables, food, plant-based food. I'm thinking that there was the hand of God in that turned this in that way. I don't think that probably typically would happen, contrasting those two kind of diets. So I don't know if you can prove that or not, but it seems reasonable to me. Monty?
It seemed that this chief of the eunuchs understood that process, because he's saying, if I let you do this, you're not going to be looking as good, and the king's going to want to know why. When I told him I'm not making you eat what the king said for you to eat, I'm going to be in big trouble. I'll lose my head over it. Yeah. So that even back then, they understood that typically vegetarian diets weren't as healthy looking as the protein diets.
Okay, I think that's right. Read just a couple more verses before we move to the next idea. Verse 17, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said that he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were all in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. Okay, so that section is not talking about the end of the 10-day test. That section is talking about the end of the 3-year training period. At the end of the 3-year training period, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were head and shoulders above all the rest in their intellectual skills that they manifested over all the others. So they're being. I would argue that clearly they are being blessed, if not miraculously, at least providentially being blessed by the hand of God in this process. All right, so when we get to chapter 2, we don't have time to read it all, but in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's famous dream. He has this famous dream, and he called, verse 2, he called the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before him, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream. We will show you the interpretation. So they said, okay, yeah, we'll be glad to tell you what the dream is or what it means. Tell us what the dream was. And Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm not telling you what the dream was because you'll invent some interpretation. I want you to tell me what my dream was. And if you can do that, I'll then have basis to believe the interpretation that you put upon it. But I'm not telling you. And they basically said, nobody can do that. Nobody, you're putting a challenge before us that no one could possibly accomplish. And they refused. They just weren't, of course, they weren't able, right? Using magic and astrology, they weren't able to do it. And so the king is ready to put them all to death. He's angry. Here I've been supporting these guys and providing for these guys, and they're worthless. They're good for nothing. And he's ready to literally execute the whole batch of magicians and sorcerers and astrologers. Wade?
I just wanted to just kind of say as a side note here. So there in chapter 2 and verse 1, it says in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And in chapter 1, it says in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Of course, God put this in here specifically so I think that we could be able to date all this and to make, this is a proof of the book of Daniel. This is a proof of God's inspiration and the things that were happening at this point. So now we can go back and we can say, Nebuchadnezzar was actually a king, and Jehoiakim was actually a king.
Yeah.
I mean, so we know these, and we know the places that they talk about.
Yeah, I think you're right. Important historical connections to be made. It is a little curious that chapter 2 starts out in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had already, much earlier, come and besieged Jerusalem and taken these captives. And we know it, at least 3 years had transpired, and in the 2nd year of his reign. But I think the reason that is because when he was besieging and conquering Jerusalem, his forefather was still the technical king, and so and now he has assumed full reign as king. I think that's the reason for that difference in dating. But I think your point's exactly right, Wade. It's important for us to know that and tie that into history. We can connect that with history. So Nebuchadnezzar is ready to kill all the magicians and sorcerers and astrologers. Daniel finds out about that, and in verse 27, skip down to verse 27. He asked for a time, and he's granted a space of time, and he comes back. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, astrologers, and magicians, and soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mayest knowest the thoughts that of thine heart. And then he goes on to describe the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And remember, we know well the image with the head of gold, and then the different metals comprising different body parts. We won't take time to go into the interpretation of that dream tonight, but we know that Daniel said these are the parts of this image, starting with you, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, and then the different body parts constructed of different metals, representative of 4 kingdoms, 4 worldwide empires. The first, the Babylonian, Nebuchadnezzar. The second, the Medo-Persian. The third, the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And the fourth, the Roman Empire. And then verse 44 is the key verse there. In the days of these kings, the Roman kings, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So that's a really famous dream, and an important dream for us. Is an important prophetic interpretation. How would Daniel know that? He couldn't have known it except he was inspired by God to make that interpretation, to have that understanding and explain it in that way. Wade?
In verse 4, it says that the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. So Aramaic was the primary language there of Babylon, correct?
Yeah, the King James Version calls it Syriac.
Yeah, and so I think that Aramaic and Hebrew are in the same class of languages, and their textual, the lettering is similar, and I think they're both read from right to left instead of left to right. And so it would have been a good transition for him to go from Hebrew to Aramaic. But you notice that later on in the New Testament, Jesus speaks in Aramaic at some point too. And so that language was still going on, and it was a popular language in the New Testament as well.
Okay, all right. Remember too that Daniel and the other young men had been trained, specifically it mentioned in learning the tongue of the Chaldeans right there at the end of chapter 1, verse 4. So he had been trained in their language usages as well. All right, so Daniel gives the interpretation, and the result of that is verse 46, chapter 2, verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and worshipped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat at the gate of the king. So as a result of this, Daniel is elevated to a position of high rank. But don't forget that when he came to do this interpreting, way back there in verse 30, he gives the honor and glory to God. And so he's not an individual who's possessed with self-importance or pride. He's not trying to promote himself. He's actually bringing honor and glory to God, which I think is evidenced there in verse 47. Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets. So Daniel had done this in such a way to glorify God more so than himself. And that's an important principle, you know. That's as it ought to be. That's the way we should be living our lives. Our purpose here is to glorify the God of heaven, our Father, our Creator. It's not to develop personal acclaim or vain glory, but to glorify God. And Daniel, I think it's clear that Daniel did that. Although he certainly reaped a benefit by virtue of interpreting this dream, I still think it's significant that what Nebuchadnezzar said was to acknowledge the God of heaven, the God that Daniel serves. And so Daniel had obviously done his work in such a fashion to point the glory to God. And that's the way it ought to be. That's what we ought to do. Thoughts or comments?
There's such a parallel between Joseph and Daniel here in relation to the interpretation of dreams, but also as you just noted, before they even began, with the power within God.
Yeah.
They benefited from it. But even going back to the wise men, they noted the same thing. This ability doesn't dwell in the flesh. Nobody can tell you that.
Yeah.
Who lives as a man. And they had priests and soothsayers instead of a priest, but their priest couldn't do it. And those relationships with God. And the other one could is the one that the true God.
Serve the true God. I think you're exactly right. Good point.
God gave Nebuchadnezzar that dream. And that why would he have a dream concerning four different time periods?
So I'm taking it that your question is, why would he choose to reveal this to Nebuchadnezzar instead of somebody else? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But the way it lines out, it stands to this day. And so we're talking, here we are on the order of almost 3,000 years later, maybe not quite that much, 2,700 years later. And this dream is still significant. We study this dream and we point out to our religious neighbors that they are misinterpreting the idea of the kingdom. And we go to Nebuchadnezzar's dream and Daniel's interpretation of it to show them why. So it's just like a lot of God's revelation. Why he did it that way, I don't think we could say, but it sure has stood the test of time.
You know, we all have dreams, but it's hard to remember. This dream you wake up, it's hard to remember that dream.
I tell you one thing I would add, Gordon, is that, you know, the Babylonians had a very determined and thorough process of chronicling the activities of the king. And so this would have been recorded in the history of that empire. And that in itself may have been the providential reason why God chose to do it that way, so that this would be recorded for all time. That might be. All right, James?
One other reason is before that we see powers come to be, and maybe they're more localized, these powers are much more widespread. This is where you see huge empires versus large, like even when Egypt was large, it's still only in a certain area. These kingdoms
Worldwide.
what we would consider all known world.
Yeah.
And so that was probably where you started when you start seeing these worldwide kingdoms, you said
Yeah, yeah. So he denotes four great worldwide empires. I think you're right. Okay, so we read there at the end of chapter 2 that Daniel continued. Let's see. No, I guess it was the end of chapter 1. Daniel continued even to the first year of King Cyrus. So what happens to the Babylonians? Well, we know that the Babylonians fall to the Medo-Persians. Remember, and there's so much neat stuff in the book of Daniel, but in chapter 5, the last Babylonian king, Belshazzar, he sees a vision of a hand writing on the wall. Remember that? And Daniel comes and interprets that sign and tells him that, well, look at verse 20, chapter 5, verse 25. The writing that was written, many, many tikol upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they robed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck, excuse me, and made proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So we've got a change now. It's kind of interesting that Daniel, he spanned those two kingdoms. Excuse me. He served under the Babylonians, high ranking. And he's going to continue now into the Medo-Persian period, also high ranking. Chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. You gotta believe that Daniel's just an exceptional individual. I mean, truly exceptional. You would think we just conquered this Babylonian empire, and we're purging the whole business. Anybody that had anything to do with the government of the Babylonians is out. In fact, we'll probably kill them all. But certainly we're not going to leave them in positions of authority. They're done. We're the new big kid on the block. And all those others are out. The fact that Daniel would prevail, that he is chosen as one of 3, the King James calls them 3 presidents, but Daniel was preferred above them all. The king thought to set him over the whole realm. That's got to speak to the just exemplary character and abilities of Daniel, that this would be so. So you know how this happens. You know the story of Daniel and the lion's den. You know that story very well. Obviously, his favored position provokes a lot of jealousy and envy in these other guys. What are we going to do about this Daniel? We're not going to get ahead. Daniel's got the inside track. Daniel is the king's favorite, fair-haired boy. And he's not a boy anymore, but he's an old man by this point in time. But, how are we going to get around this problem? Daniel's the king's right-hand man. So verse 4, the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in it. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So you know how that goes. So let's talk the king into making a rule, passing a law. And we'll tell the king that he should allow no one to pray except to him. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the decree, sign the writing, that it not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. And King Darius signed the writing. Verse 7, all the presidents and kingdom and governors of the princes, the counselors, the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. So you have to believe that this King Darius, he's probably pretty arrogant guy, pretty egomaniac kind of an individual. He's the head now of the world empire, and all these subordinates of him come say, "You're great, king, man. You are the greatest king." And we think what you ought to do is pass a law to say, no, you can't pray to any god. You can only pray to the king for 30 days. You can almost see Darius kind of puffing his chest out and say, that sounds pretty good to me. I think I could do that. But what they knew was And this was apparently a unique feature of their law, is that once a king had signed a law or a decree into force, it could not be rescinded. He could not rescind it. Once the law was set, it was set and was carried out. So these guys, they act like they're praising the king, but they're actually using him. And they talk, and so he just sort of bumbles into this, and he signs the decree. And then, of course, what Daniel did, verse 10 says, now Daniel, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. So they're pretty shrewd. They got what they wanted. This whole plan hinged upon the fact you can be sure that Daniel will pray to his God. You can be sure we're going to pass this law, and the king's going to sign it. We're going to use him. You get the idea the king wasn't maybe terribly bright, at least in regards to this matter. And he allows himself to be used because they know. But the whole plan is based upon their complete confidence that Daniel's going to keep worshiping his God. Daniel's going to keep praying to his God. In fact, we know the practice of Daniel. He goes to his chamber 3 times a day, opens his windows toward Jerusalem and prays to his God. He's going to do that. And we're going to catch him at it, and then we're going to get him thrown in the lion's den. The lion's going to eat him up, and we'll be rid of this guy. And so they thought they had a foolproof plan. But the plan was totally based upon their complete understanding that Daniel would be faithful to God no matter what. Here's my question to us. Is our reputation as servants of God so strong that someone could devise a plan like that against us? Would they say, I know that guy, he's a Christian and he's going to stand by his faith? Or would our track record be such that they say, well, we could pass this rule, but that guy's probably going to cave. He's probably going to give in. You know, he's going to surrender to the persecution and the pressure. What would be our reputation? You know, that's the challenging thought. Daniel's reputation was ironclad. They knew what he would do. Do the people around us, do we live in such a way that we present that kind of determined faithfulness and everybody knows he will not compromise. He will not give in. Obviously, that's what we need to do. I worry that we're maybe not there, but we need to be. And Daniel set such a worthy example in that regard. Well, you know how the story goes on. The king is actually upset with himself. So it says, verse 14, the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. But of course it wasn't possible. And so the king commanded, they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. And now the king spake and said to Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. A stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. I thought that was interesting. You know, so we remember how they used their signet ring to sort of make a seal. So somehow or another they sealed this stone so that and they marked it so that if it was tampered with, you could tell. But notice that these other guys are so determined. They didn't just let the king mark the seal on the den of lions. They marked it too. Because the king could come, you know, their thinking might have been, well, the king loves Daniel so much that he'll let him out and then he'll reset the seal. Let's put our seal on it too, so that it absolutely can't be tampered with. So Daniel's in the lion's den, and he's there all night. Verse 18, the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king rose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? And then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My king has sent his angel and has shut the lion's mouth, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, I have done no hurt. And the king was exceeding glad. So we have our little children's Bible drill class on Sunday evening. When we get to the story of Daniel in the lion's den, I say, well, I put this before the kids, and they always answer right. The reason the lions didn't eat Daniel is they weren't even hungry. They had been so well fed that the thought of another morsel of food in their mouth was just repulsive to them. They didn't eat him because they didn't want to eat him. They were just absolutely satiated. Their appetites they had none. And the kids say, no, that's not right. I said, well, how do you know? And then they're quick to point out, verse 24, the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. So they threw these men and their families into the lion's den, and the lions were so aggressive, they never even fell to the bottom of the den before the lions had torn them to shreds. The lions were plenty hungry. And so, again, God delivered Daniel. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote unto all the people, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. In his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so, again, I believe it's noteworthy that the outcome of this was not that Daniel himself was personally praised, period, but that the outcome of it was that Daniel's God, the God of heaven, was honored and acknowledged by this great worldly empire leader. And I really think that again goes to the very nature of Daniel. He wasn't in it for personal glory. He's certainly worthy of personal glory. And he was acknowledged, but it seems clear that he was always doing his work in such a fashion to point the glory toward God of heaven. That's the way it should be. We're out of time. Any final thoughts, anybody? Daniel's one of the great heroes of the Bible, and his example is certainly a worthy one. If you care to pick up a copy of the following study guide, we're going to back way up, and Lord willing, and by the way, I think with this new study guide, as you look at it back there in the back, we'll probably try to take two people in each class period. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to go all the way back and talk about Adam and Eve.